2nd of May 1999. In a small town in Texas, police officers logged one of the worst crime scenes in local memory. A clergyman and his wife had been bludgeoned to death in their bed.
The brutality of the crime was something that you only hear about in horror shows.
Soon, a man who traveled the railway to find his victims was on the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list. Tensions spread throughout the community as one of America's largest manhunts got underway.
I believe everybody was scared, especially if they lived next to railroad tracks.
It was a killer on the run, thumbing his nose at law enforcement and continuing to kill.
Along with police, there are others who chronicle the investigation in great detail, on film, on paper, and on tape. Through their lenses, they capture the story of the Railcar killer. By all appearances, West University Place, Texas, is a tranquil place, a residential area close to Houston. The tree-lined streets provide a sanctuary from the bustle and tension of the city.
West University Place has a population, by and large, upper middle class to upper class people. People like to move into there, especially people who want to live in the city and have city atmosphere, but yet their little neighborhood gives them a sense of a community. The crime problem there is essentially very low.
The 16th of December 1998, Dr. Claudia Benton was a well-known and respected doctor, devoted to her work. She lived in a house near the railway line with her husband and 2 daughters.
Houston is a center in the world for medical research, and she was one of the leading researchers in the community.
She was a very well-liked lady, quite a professional.
In the evening hours, Dr. Benton was saying goodbye to her husband and 2 daughters who were on their way to Arizona to visit family before the Christmas holidays.
So Dr. Benton was alone in the house. She had a presentation to deliver the next morning and was working late in her bedroom upstairs.
It appears that she had been watching TV and working on her laptop computer, that she may have just gradually fallen asleep, say sometime before midnight.
The 17th of December, morning. Dr. Benton failed to arrive to give her presentation. Waiting friends and colleagues became anxious.
Several of her co-workers had called the police department wanting us to go by the house to do a welfare check. No one was able to get in touch with her all day long.
That afternoon, local police officers went into the house. There were signs of a break-in, and several rooms were in a state of disarray. Upstairs, they found Dr. Benton dead beneath a blood-stained blanket. A butcher's knife lay nearby.
And it was a gruesome crime scene.
My initial thoughts, it was overkill. It was very, very violent. I went through the house to view everything. I had a scared feeling. I knew that the other officers had been through that house, but I myself went through and looked in every closet and every crack and crevice to make sure that the person who may have done this was not still there. I had never been involved with the case of this magnitude.
It was clear to them that this was a very, very heinous crime and it was going to be pretty difficult to try and solve.
Forensic experts from the Houston Police Department arrived to examine and process the scene of the crime.
So we photographed the outside of the house, and then we work our way in, and then we just work our way toward where the actual victim is lying, and we'll photograph everything. When you get to a crime scene, you don't disturb anything. You try to photograph everything as it is. And then when the medical examiner starts taking the blankets off, then you start taking photographs as you're basically removing layers.
Dr. Benton was found to have multiple stab wounds in her back and hands, as well as fractures to her skull. the latter inflicted by a bronze statuette lying on the floor. She had also been sexually assaulted.
What they saw was devastating, that a person could be treated in such a way.
Whoever killed her had a lot of rage.
You know, so many murders, it's generally domestic. It's very rarely a stranger crime. And it became pretty clear from the beginning that this was going to be a stranger crime.
We just realized that this is somebody differently that's very dangerous. And he was possibly some type of serial murderer just by, what was in the crime scene.
The proximity of the railway line was also noted.
There was probably 4 or 5 trains that came by, being 40 to 50 yards away from the railroad tracks. I was thinking to myself how convenient it would be to wait for a train to come by and get into a house, to be able to walk in the house, walk upstairs, and absolutely not be heard because of all the train noise.
That evening, an officer broke the tragic news to Dr. Benton's husband, who was then in Arizona with their 2 children.
Talking to him initially was very difficult. I tried to put myself in his position if I was getting a call about my spouse possibly being brutally murdered. It was utter shock.
At the same time, news of the murder spread, creating great alarm amongst local residents.
The profile of the victim made it an intention-getting case. Also, the kind of grisly nature of the crime. Woman home alone, attacked, sexually assaulted, murdered, is enough to raise that profile and get anybody's attention.
Because of the sexual assault, the coroner performing the autopsy was able to secure DNA samples from the killer's semen found on Dr. Benton's body. If police could track down a suspect, they might be able to associate him directly with the assault. The following morning, detectives began to interview Claudia Benton's friends and members of her family, seeking any information possibly related to the crime. They also accompanied her husband on a walk through the house, hoping he would see something out of the ordinary. Items were missing, including a stereo and some jewelry. He also noticed that his wife's Jeep had gone. As the keys had not been taken, it was concluded the suspect hot-wired the vehicle and used it to escape from the murder scene. In the garage, they found a piece of broken plastic.
And when we looked at it further, we realized it was the housing from the steering column from the Jeep. When I looked at the underneath of the steering column, I could see fingerprints, 3 beautiful, distinct fingerprints, and I knew those had to have been from the suspect. I knew that we had something to go on.
The prints were lifted from the plastic and entered into databases across America. As hoped, a match was turned up, but it was puzzling. The fingerprints seemed to belong to a shadowy figure from Mexico who had gone by at least 9 known aliases in previous encounters with the law. The most common name he used was Rafael Reséndiz Ramirez. The suspect was either 39 or 40 years of age.
Rafael Reséndiz Ramirez was truly a drifter. If there's a definition of a drifter, he fit that bill.
His favorite mode of transportation was the train, and he would catch trains in the rail yards and go wherever they took him.
When Dr. Benton's missing Jeep was found abandoned next to the railway line in San Antonio, police discovered Reséndiz's fingerprints inside the vehicle. They now had a positive lead.
Once that match was made, then you at least had a suspect, a real firm suspect, who had no reason to be in that car. She didn't sell the car to him, she didn't loan it to him, he didn't work for her, had no reason to be there.
When I first heard the name and that we did have someone identified, I was very, very happy. The next step, though, obviously, is trying to find the guy, and I knew that would be probably one of the most difficult things.
The search would grip all America, especially when a violent killer decided to strike again. January 1999. The police force in Texas was investigating the murder of Dr. Claudia Benton. Their prime suspect was a drifter from Mexico known as Rafael Reséndiz Ramirez.
I was able to make a timeline of his activities, pieced together from all the information that was in his file. I had pictures, old ID cards, and so forth, and it made himself look so different from year to year. It was quite amazing seeing the transformations.
Resendiz's criminal record under various names included illegal entry into the United States, as well as assault, burglary, and drugs-related charges.
He had a fairly extensive criminal history. He was deported, returned back to the U.S., charged with immigration issues, deported, back and forth and back and forth.
Posters were put up throughout Texas showing the suspect's various guises. Immigration officials were instructed to be alert for Resendiz's possible appearance at the Mexican border. Some officers felt that if Reséndiz was indeed their man, he might have slipped back into Mexico. Others feared he was still in Texas and could strike again. May 1999. Weimar, Texas. This little town of 2,000 people is situated on the railway line west of Houston, 90 miles from the scene of the attack on Claudia Benton. Weimar had only a few full-time police officers and no crime scene unit.
Weimar is a really neat, small, rural town. Very friendly, very open, very little crime. We have a lot of churches in Weimar. It's a very religious community.
We have great people, friendly people, willing to help one another. It's just a nice town to live in.
Two highly respected people in the community were 46-year-old Norman Cernick and his wife Karen.
Reverend Cernick was the pastor of the United Church of Christ. He and his wife are very, very involved in the church, well-liked, very well-respected. Always had a smile on their face, always greeting other people.
The 2nd of May. It was a Sunday morning. Many townsfolk attended their weekly service of worship. At the United Church of Christ, Reverend Cernick was uncharacteristically late.
I think the church services started around 9:30. Congregation had gathered there and no preacher.
A member of the church decided to walk over to the Cernick's house, which was close by. He saw the door was unlocked. Inside, the minister and his wife lay dead in their bedroom, obviously victims of a savage attack. The murder weapon lay nearby.
They were brutally assaulted in their sleep. They had been killed with a sledgehammer that had been taken from the garage of the Cernick's residence. They were both hit in the head with a sledgehammer.
As the scene was cordoned off, word of the gruesome crime spread like wildfire through the small town, soon reaching the mayor, Benny Kozler.
So I went up to the house where the Cernicks were, and then the chief was there. And I told him, I said, Chief, this is something new to both of us. I don't ever remember of a murder in Weimar.
You immediately began trying to figure out, who in the world could have done something like this.
This had to be some kind of drifter. No one locally done this. I said, Bill, whatever this takes, do it, get it. I said, we'll worry about the dollars later.
That afternoon, the police in Weimar received assistance at the scene from a nearby sheriff's office and also the Texas Rangers.
We collected all sorts of evidence. Pieces of food that we believe he may have eaten, to evidence from the bodies, evidence in the house. Fingerprints were taken all over every place. Just tons and tons and tons of evidence.
Those familiar with the Claudia Benton murder near Houston were quick to point out the similarities between the incidents.
Vehicles were taken, trinkets were taken from both scenes. The murders were brutal. Both occurred at residences which were very close to a railroad track.
Karen Cernick had also been sexually assaulted. The autopsy provided a semen sample and a DNA profile of the killer. When compared with the profile from the Benton scene, forensic experts found a match. Rafael Reséndiz Ramirez became a prime suspect for both crimes.
Then we began to go, wow, where does this start? Where does it end? You know, we knew we had at least 3 homicides. How many more, we had no idea.
A reward of $50,000 was offered for any information leading to the capture of the Mexican drifter. In the center of Houston, a growing FBI team began to coordinate efforts between state and local police forces.
We've got to try to get this solved as quickly as we possibly can before he strikes again. What we did was immediately got in touch with the chief of police up in that area and the sheriff in those counties and let them know what we had down here. And we just sort of brought them in and put them on our task force.
Officers scrutinized his aliases and stated dates of birth in order to establish any clue to his true identity south of the Mexican border. If they could track down any of his family or friends, they'd be a step closer to finding the man himself. At the same time, extra teams patrolled the streets of Weimar, keeping a close watch on the railway tracks. Police officer Bill Livingston tried to reassure the fearful townspeople that another attack in the same place was most unlikely.
I had what I thought was a difficult job in that I was trying to pacify my citizens and let them know that everything was safe and they were secure. But at the same time, I had to keep up the hype on this individual.
When folks hear the words serial killer, it becomes more to them than just a random crime. It becomes a premeditated act, and everybody's a potential victim.
People that had never had guns before bought guns. People that had old guns stored someplace, got them out and put bullets in them.
Everybody started putting bars in the windows and security systems, and making sure that all the doors and windows were locked. I know my wife said she didn't realize we had that many windows in the house until she started locking them.
People were scared, and rightfully so.
The 4th of June, 1999. 3 miles west of Weimar, along the same stretch of railway track, a local woman drove into a farmyard accompanied by her husband. The farm belonged to the woman's mother, Josephine Konvichka.
Josephine Konvichka was a 73-year-old widow woman. I'm told she was a lady who liked to make jelly. She had grandchildren, she loved them, and her daughter and her son-in-law had gone to the house to feed the animals, check on her mother. And when she went in the bedroom, she was found dead, bludgeoned in the head. She went screaming out of the house to her husband, who's in the barn, saying, "Mom's been killed."
Just a few miles from the Cernick crime, Josephine Konvichka had been bludgeoned to death with a pickaxe. Sheriff Rick Vandal was one of the first officers to arrive at the farm.
It was just a cold-blooded murder. The senseless killing. It just tears your guts out. You're just overwhelmed. The daughter was devastated. I know she'll never forget what she saw when she opened that door in that bedroom. It'll be with her the rest of her life.
Police sniffer dogs soon tracked the scent of Josephine's killer to the nearby railway tracks, where the trail vanished.
They were able to determine that he spent a little time in there. He fixed him some food. ate a couple plums, made him some toast.
He had to be sort of an animal to what he done, and then to eat in that same house, you know, it's just unbelievable.
They were able to secure a fingerprint off of a deep freeze that was right beside the window where he came in.
When the print was examined in Houston, it confirmed everyone's worst suspicions. It was Rafael Reséndiz Ramirez, who was terrorizing the small Texan community.
That's when everybody, sure enough, went berserk.
I felt absolutely awful. I was the one that told the people of Weimar that, you know, people don't come back, a murderer does not come back to the scene of the crime. You know, don't worry, everything's going to be safe. People don't do that. And then he did, almost as to taunt us.
The day after Josephine Konvichka's body was discovered, another corpse turned up in similar circumstances, this time east of Houston. Noemi Dominguez, a 26-year-old schoolteacher, was found dead in her flat, which was also situated near the railway line. She'd been clubbed to death. The FBI also identified Reséndiz as the prime suspect in the killing of Christopher Meyer, a university student beaten to death 2 years previously in the state of Kentucky.
It just kept mushrooming and mushrooming, and they found where he was a suspect in other crimes in other cities, in other areas.
Anxiety increased as media coverage intensified.
I don't know who dubbed the name Railcar Killer, but it stuck pretty quickly. It was the Railcar Killer, the Railcar Killer. Even for people who knew this guy's name, we were also, nobody used his name, it was the Railcar Killer. And that was the big headline.
The spate of murders apparently gaining pace, Rafael Reséndiz Ramirez was about to become the target of one of the most intensive manhunts in American history. June 1999. In Houston, Texas, an FBI task force, dozens of officers strong, searched high and low for Rafael Reséndiz Ramirez, a drifter from Mexico, by then widely known as the Railcar Killer. He had murdered as many as 6 people. Some investigators thought he began with a plan to rob his victims, only to be overcome by an overwhelming compulsion to wreak violence on them.
It certainly seems the intent may have been, I'll just steal goods, food, and feed myself and steal what I can of value that I think is of value. But when somebody showed up, or if they were already there, then that other inner demon came through and he had to do something. This was his pattern of technique, is to overwhelm them immediately with blunt force so that they would not be able to defend themselves.
In Weimar, home of 3 of the victims, the Railcar Killer glared from wanted posters displayed all over town. The sound of each approaching train struck terror in everyone.
This area was the target of Reséndiz Ramirez.
All the people who lived along where that train track goes were afraid. They were in fear. Many of them left home to go live with their siblings somewhere or other relatives. So you just wonder, is he going to be able to kill anybody else in your county here, or anybody's for that matter? You want to protect them.
Believing there was safety in numbers, some families living near the railway tracks began to sleep all in one room.
People were on edge. Our call volume increased dramatically. People that heard noises or heard something in their backyard were calling. But we had citizens that were armed all of a sudden. And I was afraid that for my officers' safety, if they're trying to do their job in somebody else's backyard and a neighbor may see him and think, my gosh, who is this?
It affected me every night. Just never knew when he was going to jump off that train.
Officers the length and breadth of southern Texas combed abandoned stretches of track, looking for places where Reséndiz might camp out. Homeless shelters throughout the states also came under scrutiny.
People knew who to look for, they just didn't know where he was.
We physically took the leaflets or flyers to the border to pass those out down there so that everybody could have them, so they could help find this guy.
At the FBI Command Center, investigators examined the pattern of Reséndiz's known movements. They believed he often rode the freight train eastwards along the San Antonio to Houston line, but then drove back west in cars that he stole from his victims. Hoping to catch him in transit, Operation Train Stop was initiated. In June, 100 officers searched all eastward-bound freight trains as they stopped briefly at points. Dogs sniffed out fare dodgers, while helicopters above watched for escapees.
I personally never realized how a person could hide on a train car. Yeah, I mean, it just seems to me like a big old boxcar. You're either sitting inside or you're not. But there's just a number of little places on there.
Along another stretch of the railway line, police found almost 24 suspected illegal immigrants hiding in freight cars. Reséndiz, however, was not among them.
We even built a platform in the back of our offices, in the back of City Hall, that stood up high enough where we could look down into boxcars, rail cars. We felt like we had a lot better vantage point from that height. Every time a train came through Weimar, one of the officers was on that platform day and night with spotlights or flashlights or whatever we had to have to check every single train. If we found somebody on the train, then we got it stopped and searched the train, got those people off the train. We questioned those people and asked them, showed them his picture so that we could try to get any other information as to where he might be or what he might be doing.
Some officers suspected Reséndiz had moved out of the state or simply gone to another part of Texas.
I mean, we're watching one little rail that runs between Houston and San Antonio. You know, there are train tracks all over the United States. It could be anywhere.
The 15th of June. In Gorham, Illinois, hundreds of miles to the north of Weimar, an 80-year-old man named George Morber and his daughter Caroline Frederick were found dead in a mobile home near a railway line, shot and beaten to death with a shotgun. This crime scene was exceptionally gruesome. Fingerprints indicated Reséndiz to be the assailant. About the same time came discouraging news for those involved in the manhunt. Agents discovered that 2 weeks earlier, their suspect was briefly in the custody of Border Patrol officers during one of his many illegal crossings between Mexico and the United States. At the time, immigration computers were not linked to the FBI database. Therefore, when Reséndiz's prints were entered into the system, immigration officials were not alerted to his status as a wanted man. 3 people had been killed since that day.
The public was justifiably outraged, and it was difficult for folks to understand how such a high-profile criminal could be caught by a law enforcement organization and then promptly released.
Facing a rising body count and growing public pressure, the man leading the task force, FBI Special Agent Don Clark, asked his Washington bureau for extra resources.
Because this was an epidemic that wasn't going to stop, and we needed to get this guy on the top 10 most wanted list, get the media involved, get the nation involved, and then we close down avenues that this person can go freely.
On the 21st of June 1999, Rafael Reséndiz Ramirez, now a suspect in at least 8 murders, was added to the FBI's list of most wanted criminals, alongside notorious fugitives like Osama bin Laden.
Being on that list added so many more resources to our capabilities to look for this person. It also gave us the opportunity to offer a substantial reward.
Well, the FBI's top 10 list is what gained the national attention and started pushing the case onto the national newscasts.
We had 24 hours around the clock going, and then it got to almost a personal point. We didn't want to have to live with knowing that somebody else had been killed before we got our hands on this guy.
It was a fixture on our news on a daily basis. Every newscast, there was something about the search for him.
People were hearing trains every place, to include myself. They wanted us to catch this guy at all costs.
In following up one of their best leads to that point, the investigators established Rafael Reséndiz Ramirez's true identity south of the border. According to a birth certificate found in Puebla in Mexico, he was born Ángel Leoncio Reyes Reséndiz on the 1st of August 1959. The search then led them to the Mexican town of Rodeo. It soon became clear that their suspect had been leading a double life. Inhabitants of Rodeo immediately recognized the face on the FBI's wanted poster as Ángel Reséndiz, an unremarkable local man with a common-law wife and a young child.
But although he drifted, it's unusual because he frequently went back to his family and he frequently had contact with some of the family members.
His common-law wife claimed she hadn't seen her husband for at least 2 weeks. She admitted he often went to the United States, but refused to accept he was capable of violence.
It was very important to us to try and get the family involved in this, to bring him in to us so that justice could be served. You love your loved one, the best thing to do is to assist in this investigation and try to get him to turn himself in, or you assist us in turning him in.
The police also learned that Reséndiz had a half-sister in the United States.
His sister was in New Mexico. The initial phone call with her was just to ask her if she had had any contact with her brother, if she knew where he might be. I didn't get a whole lot from her at the time. What she told me is she hadn't seen him and had much contact with her brother.
As police kept in touch with the Railcar killer's family, the intense media coverage of the manhunt also brought an endless flow of information from the public.
The most important thing was to be able to have an entrance point for people to call in from any place in the country about tips that they may have. And then the second is to be able to sort through these as quickly as we could.
At one point, more than 1,200 calls had come in to the FBI's command center saying, "I've seen him here. No, I've seen him here. I've seen him here."
In Kentucky, a woman contacted the police claiming she had recently spoken to a Hispanic man matching Reséndiz's description. Investigators swept through shelters for the homeless in the state looking for any sign of him. In Columbus, Ohio, police stopped a train and scoured the vicinity with dogs after a witness claimed to have spotted Reséndiz on board.
We would have analysts to be able to go through these and try to sort through and prioritize these tips. Do we think that this person could have gone from here to there in the last 24-hour period, that we really think that he was over to this location?
Most tips came from the area around the stretch of railway between Houston and San Antonio, where the residents remained on high alert. When police officers searched Reséndiz's wife's home in Mexico, they confiscated numerous pieces of jewelry given to her by her husband. Photos of the valuables were shown to the families of victims north of the border. Many identified the items as belonging to their deceased relatives, piling on further evidence against the FBI's prime suspect. In early July 1999, it was announced that Reséndiz was now the prime suspect in a 9th murder, that of 87-year-old Leafy Mason, found beaten to death the previous autumn in Hughes Springs, Texas. At the same time, police kept talking to the railcar killer's family, hoping they would convince the suspect to turn himself in. The manhunt now reached fever pitch, and the dialogue with the family started to bear fruit. Reséndiz's half-sister began to make overtures to the police concerning her brother's possible surrender.
Phone calls became a little bit more consistent between her and the team that was talking to her, and it started to appear that she was really moving towards that point of making this happen.
A Texas Ranger, accompanied by FBI agents, met the woman in New Mexico. The sister admitted she had been in contact with Reséndiz, who was in hiding in Mexico. Facing almost certain capture if he ever surfaced in America, he was willing to discuss his options. As they spoke, she relayed information by phone to other relatives south of the border who were presumably in direct contact with Reséndiz himself.
I think one of the most significant parts of this is that she was able to get them to understand that this was not going to go away. So you can go this way, or eventually you're going to be captured one way or the other.
Some people thought that Reséndiz was afraid of bounty hunters in Mexico, motivated by the reward of $125,000. Even though he could face the death penalty in Texas, he would presumably prefer to be captured alive rather than dead.
The one promise that you could make is that if he turns himself in, we will ensure his safety, and nobody's going to shoot him on the spot, or something of that nature. But you have to be clear that he's going to go before the justice system, and whatever happens, you know, justice will be done.
The FBI were able to essentially get in with family members and convince them that it was in his best interest to turn himself in.
A tentative agreement was reached. According to Reséndiz's half-sister, one of the most wanted men in America would arrive at the U.S. border early the next morning. The news was transmitted to the FBI command center in Houston. While some expressed skepticism, others hoped the endgame of their massive manhunt was finally approaching. The 13th of July, 1999, early morning. Close to El Paso, Texas, police officers moved into place on the American side of the bridge that led to Mexico. If Reséndiz actually showed up, the railcar killer may finally be taken into custody. If he didn't, he would remain free and capable of killing again. The 13th of July, 1999. Near El Paso, Texas, on the American side of a bridge linking the United States with Mexico, police agencies waited anxiously for the appearance of the serial killer Rafael Reséndiz Ramirez. The target of one of the largest manhunts in American history, he had declared his willingness to surrender. 9 a.m. As scheduled, Reséndiz appeared on the other side. He was accompanied by his brother. A Texas Ranger went out to meet him, joined by the fugitive's sister and a priest.
The surrender itself happened right in the middle of the International Bridge, and Reséndiz walked across the bridge, met Texas Ranger Carter in the middle of the bridge.
The killer greeted the Ranger with a handshake. Seconds later, he was in handcuffs and on his way to Houston.
We were waiting at the airport when he arrived here. He was taken off the plane in shackles and handcuffs and led across the tarmac. I expected to see maybe someone who was kind of beaten down, and he struck me as not the slightest bit concerned about the fact that he was in custody.
Despite Reséndiz's confident nonchalance, news of the surrender brought enormous relief to a beleaguered population.
We held our press conference in the middle of the afternoon, and everybody was there. And there was just a flurry of questions about, you know, how did you guys do this? It was really a pretty delightful and relieving environment there. It was all about the railcar killer being apprehended. So it was a great experience and feeling.
Nowhere was that more true than in the vicinity of Weimar, Texas, a town that had been held hostage by trepidation.
When I found out he was arrested, I was elated. You know, all of a sudden you can take a breath. You know, you can begin to relax. He hadn't been tried, he hadn't been convicted and all that, but he was in custody and people were happy about it.
I remember the day that he was captured. I was sitting in my office, and I was so relieved. I broke down, don't mind telling you, I broke down and cried. I was so relieved.
As Texas rejoiced in the good news, investigators interviewed Reséndiz and secured blood, hair, and saliva samples for DNA testing.
When I saw him in person, it's like most criminals that I had come in contact with, that no matter how heinous their crimes have been, when you see them sitting behind a table or with handcuffs on or whatever the case may be, you wonder, is that the guy that really did all of this? You know, I mean, could that little guy have done all of this?
Although Reséndiz could face as many as 9 murder charges in various places, the authorities proceeded first with the case involving Dr. Claudia Benton near Houston. A conviction for that murder alone could invoke the death penalty, rendering further trials unnecessary.
Harris County, Texas is not the place that you want to be tried for capital murder. More people have been put to death by this county than any other county in the country.
The 8th of May, 2000. In a packed court, Reséndiz arrived to confront the evidence against him. DNA science now tied him directly to the horrific murder and sexual assault of Dr. Claudia Benton.
When I watched him in court, to have people relate the information that they did about how he assaulted others, and for him to sit there and show absolutely no emotion, at least none that I could see, I felt like there had to be ice water running through his veins.
Faced with insurmountable proof, the legal team defending Reséndiz admitted that their client committed the crime, as well as the other murders he had been charged with. But they asserted he suffered from paranoid schizophrenia and was not sane at the time of the attacks.
It was obvious from the beginning of his incarceration and interaction with attorneys that an insanity plea is what was going to transpire. That is what transpired, and the jury simply didn't buy it.
After a short hearing, the jury returned with their verdict. They found Reséndiz guilty of capital murder. He was sentenced to death by lethal injection.
I think that the conviction and the sentencing brought a tremendous amount of closure to the families and relatives and friends of all the people that he killed. I also believe that his execution will bring another bit of closure to those same individuals.
Although the man known as Rafael Reséndiz Ramirez received the ultimate sentence, nothing could erase the pain caused by his wickedness and the widespread reign of terror he exercised.
The family of these people, they will live for that forever. That'll stay in their hearts, minds, all their life. And to this very day, you still see people with having a light on in their backyard and what they used to not have.
I never realized that where I live, I could hear a train whistle or a train going through, but now I can hear every train whistle. Or I go across a railroad track and I see a train going across. I'm trying to look and see where would a person be hiding on that train. It's an open car. Where would they be hiding?
It'll just be great to know that this guy will be put away. I'm sure he has family. I feel for his family. But, you know, for the things he has done, he needs to go.
For me, the case won't be over really until the death penalty is administered.